Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
This is Mark Turin in Ithaca, New York, on Tuesday, the 31st of August, 2004, and it gives me great pleasure to be sitting here with Professor Bernd Lambert of Cornell University and to have the chance to ask him a few questions about his career, his life in anthropology, and so on. Bernd, if I may start, could we get some basic background information? May I ask where you were born and in which country?
I was born in 1932 in Frankfurt, in Germany, and my parents at that time lived in Bulgaria, where my father was a bank director. But my mother, as was usual in those days, had never been away from home, so she wanted to be near her parents, who lived in a suburb of Mainz. And we left Bulgaria, fortunately, just 2 weeks after the German troops marched in. You see, Bulgaria was supposedly an ally of Germany at the time, but without too much independence. And my father had lost his job back in 1936, and it was high time we left. And so we got to America by way of the Trans-Siberian Express across the Soviet Union and Japan. And then by the time we got to San Francisco, my parents' money had pretty much run out. So that's why I grew up in California instead of New York, which was our first destination. Now, I had been at home. We talked politics a great deal, and so sort of thought I'd be a lawyer. In those days, teenagers were not as fully informed about possible careers as they are now, but for my first 3 semesters at Berkeley, I was a political science major with officially pre-legal, but it became the only C I ever got in college was a political science course, and it became, by the time I was a sophomore, it became pretty clear to me that I couldn't do what lawyers do. So by that time I had I was taking a course from an introductory cultural anthropology from John H. Rowe, who, from my point of view, was a charismatic teacher, but apparently from no one else's point of view. Like, Doggy, here's a snack, but you gotta lie down. Sorry about this. Dog, pooch, hey, dope. Excuse me, I know this isn't part of the interview, but I have to dispose of the dog here. Okay. Now lie down.
Perhaps before we go too far into the career, could you tell me a little more about your family background and how what you know about perhaps parents and grandparents or great-grandparents?
Okay. After collecting a lot of genealogies in what was then the Gilbert Islands, is now the Republic of Kiribati, I decided I better know my own genealogy. So my mother's brother, who had survived World War II in Amsterdam after the war, he visited us from time to time. So I collected my mother's genealogy from my mother and my uncle, and then asked my father for his. They didn't do it quite the way Gilbertese did it. It was more lateral. That is, they knew cousins, but not ancestors very well. Well, not to get too far afield, but since you asked, on my father's side, I think my great-grandfather, I think, was a kosher butcher, but I'm not sure. And my grandfather, who is the only one of my grandparents that I really knew, had a shoe store in northern Germany, where my father was born. My mother's father, who was murdered by Hitler, had a dry goods, I guess that's what they still call it, sold cloth and things like that, in a town called Bischofsheim near Mainz, where my mother grew up. And my grandfather had originated in the Rhineland, but for reasons that either I never asked and so on, he had gone to Blumenthal, which is near Bremen, and there he had a shoe store. My father had attended gymnasium, which is of a classical high school, but like many others in those days, around 1909, when he was about 16, he dropped out of school. And my father was born in 1893, my mother in 1909. And my father, as I said, dropped out of school. He was good at languages, but not at math. In any case, it was time to go to work. So he went to Frankfurt and found a position with, I think, a bank there. It pays to ask your parents stories while you still can, because thinking about it, I was interested too, but my father, for reasons I will explain, did not like to talk about the past, especially certain critical points in it. Anyway, he was drafted into the German army in October 15th, 1914. As it happened, I was drafted into the American army exactly 40 years later, October 15th, 1954. And after the war, my sister just recently told me he didn't feel that the younger men who had not experienced the war could understand what happened. Nowadays they would call it traumatic stress syndrome or something. In those days, you could spend 4 years in the trenches and lose an eye in the war and simply get on with your life. Now we know it's not so simple. And I think a bank called the Kreditbank, had taken over the bank that he originally worked for. And in those days, somebody asked me once if Jews were in segregated units in the German army. Well, of course they weren't. I would say of course, because it was a different kind of thing, but if you wanted a job or you wanted to get ahead and were Jewish, you knew that you had to do it in certain parts of the country like Frankfurt and in certain lines of business, because others, there was no chance of advancement. It would be a dead end, or they wouldn't hire you in the first place. Anyway, my father, who then in the Weimar Republic days, got a job handling foreign currency for a bank, for the Kreditbank, and they sent him to Sofia, where by about 1930, he had become the director of this branch of the Kreditbank was eventually taken over by the Deutsche Bank. So, because he wasn't located in Germany itself, he managed to hang on to his job really rather late, 1936, when a man from headquarters came, and after being entertained by my father, said that it was an impossible circumstance that a Jew should be the manager of the German bank, so the Deutsche Bank. So he lost his job and then tried export, import, and other things. But finally, my mother, who was much less averse to breaking rules than my father, who was quite German, in a good sense, but rules were rules. But my mother got us, for my parents, my sister, and me, 4 places on the German quota for the German, you know, that in those days there were quotas on how many immigrants from a particular country could come to America. This was not a quota that originated in Germany, it was an American law. And my mother kind of arranged to have us skip several places and get those places on the German quota to America. And well, we came to San Francisco beginning of May 1941. And my father then went to, there was obviously no chance of him being hired by a bank. So he went to night school and became a public accountant, not a certified public accountant, but just someone. He worked in an accounting office for a while, and later had some clients himself and clients from a friend who had died. So he was mostly very small-scale accountant on Greek groceries and a photography supply place and so on in San Francisco. He, but in 1947, my parents started a business, and this was a knitting store. My mother didn't like knitting all that much, but she was awfully good at getting both at dealing with her customers and at designing things that would look good on them. My father, who of course couldn't knit at all and had no idea of how it was done, but he was good at business, and so they always got a discount on the wool they ordered and so on. And he managed that end of the store. Eventually they had at least 3 employees and some part-time help. So that was the family background.
Thank you for that. It's very interesting. And
Yeah,
important.
it's kind of, I know now it's kind of a typical immigrant story. This is what immigrants seldom, unless they're computer scientists and so, immigrants seldom get to do what they did in the old country. But they start businesses and work very hard at them and so on. So it was a knitting store. And
May I ask the names of your parents?
yeah, my father's name, he died in 1982. His name was Fritz originally, Fred in America. And my mom, who's still alive at 95, well, her original name was Biene, and my father didn't like that, so he changed it to Sabine when they got married. And then she changed the last letter from E to A, so she's Sabina Lambert. The reason we're Lambert, I don't know if I mentioned that, was that is not our original name. Our original name was Levy, L-E-V-Y. But when we were in Japan with my parents somewhat desperately trying to get our luggage released by the Soviets, who had temporarily confiscated it because it wasn't packed right or something, met a woman there who I think was Dutch, and she said, there are too many Germans here. By that time, German meant not Jewish, that I can't call you Herr und Frau Levy, so why don't you change your name to Lambert? Because she had known a sea captain she was fond of named Lambert. So that's how. My parents also wanted to change my first name to something less German, but I had, even at the age of 8, been identified with it, so I kept it. And
your sister is younger or elder?
Younger. She's 3 years younger than me. Her name is Marion.
She was also born in Sofia? Or?
She was born in Sofia. I was born in Frankfurt, but in 1936, when she was born, it was risky for Jewish people to go back to Germany because they might not let you out again. No one knew. So she was born in Sofia.
What language did you speak in the family?
German, as long as we lived in Europe. Both my sister and I learned Bulgarian, of course, when we started school. Kids do that. And then promptly when we got to America, forgot all the Bulgarian we'd ever known. In America, when this happened, I don't know, but fairly early, began speaking English to each other and to our parents, and they spoke German to us. My mother stopped speaking German, I'm not sure when, say around certainly after my father died in '82. And now she really speaks only English. It's you can see the influence of German in the English she speaks, but she practically never says anything in German anymore. She lives in a retirement community in San Francisco. And
was Yiddish part of the linguistic sphere in which you grew up?
No. German Jews spoke Yiddish until about the middle of the 19th century. And then they became assimilated enough into German life that they dropped Yiddish for German. So if you were in a German Jewish family, say 1932 when I was born, the language at home would be German.
Quite different then to many of the Polish,
Yes,
Lithuanian Jews.
because Germany was thought of as a good place to be Jewish, which sounds terribly ironic now, but Jews had a far better chance at being accepted, earning a living, having careers in Germany than they did further east. And there were also, German Jews were also a tiny minority compared to Polish Jews. For all the noise the anti-Semites made about it, what they were talking about was 1% or less of the German population. So it wasn't large, somewhat isolated communities that you had in Poland, where of course they spoke Yiddish until World War II.
My final question about the background. is that of the cultural world in which you grew up. I can imagine that for urbane and fairly integrated German Jews,
Yeah.
you were friends, or your parents were friends with all kinds of people. But was there a Jewish milieu around them? Did they attend synagogue, and were they part of Jewish culture?
That I don't know for sure, because after I was born, they never lived in Germany. They lived in Bulgaria, where they had Jewish friends, but also non-Jewish friends. In fact, it became more of a Jewish milieu when they moved to America, because they, for the first few years, they associated mostly with other refugees, people who shared their background, which bothered the younger generation like us, because we wanted our parents to have American friends. But now, of course, I understand what was going on. It wasn't like my mother did graduate from high school in Mainz. My father, as I said, quit school in the 10th grade, though given the kind of schooling he had, he was better educated than, say, an American who leaves school at 16. They liked to read books and listen to music. They weren't like the classic upper middle class, highly educated Jews. I mean, it wasn't like that. But on the other hand, my father had German virtues. He could accept hierarchy. I mean, he wasn't, I'm sorry about the pooch. Yep. Yeah, he should, he normally just goes to sleep when he's here, but thanks for stroking him. That will keep him quiet for.
Please continue. It's fine.
Okay. Well, anyway, so I guess you could call my father upper middle class as long as he was a bank director, but there was less. My parents, it wasn't like places, families you read about where they read Tolstoy or Shakespeare or so on. They read books about politics, some novels, some history. But they were the kind of people who took it for granted that their children would go to college, even in the 40s. And they were also, they also gave me a start in being a reader. I mean, both my sister and I learned to read German several years before we started school. And then we switched to English soon enough after we got here.
Do you have many memories of that journey? I mean, we've spoken about it before over anthropology department parties, but I would love to hear any memories you have of that long trek via.
Yeah, well, it was the advantage, or kind of the advantages, that in those days, parents, German, American, or what have you, tried to avoid discussing their worries in front of the children. So the children picked up that their parents were quite anxious about things, but parents didn't discuss their anxieties with children, not in those days. Especially when we made that trip, I was 8 and my sister was 5, so we wouldn't be much of a empathetic listeners anyway. But it was from the Bulgarian port of Varna. We traveled across the Black Sea to Odessa, and then by train Odessa, Moscow, and I think it was a 9-day trip from Moscow to Vladivostok. And one of the things I remember was seeing women do heavy manual work. Even in Bulgaria, as underdeveloped as it was you wouldn't have seen that. Soviet Union, of course, it was taken for granted. And it's one story I learned much later, I think after my father's death. It was this. He was approached by a young Jewish man in the Moscow hotel, I guess, where we were living. And this man had been lured back to Moscow by his mother, who said that how good life was there and how they could have his own apartment. Of course, he couldn't have his own apartment. He was living in a collective apartment like other people. And he asked my father if he knew of an organization that could get him back to what was then Palestine. My father immediately turned and walked away. And sure enough, some NKVD types who were hanging around said, you know, what did you talk about? What did he say? My father by that time had experience with totalitarian regimes. And careful. There's another event. I have to go back to Bulgaria. My sister was in kindergarten when we left. But at home, we've always talked politics. And so she said on the streetcar once, in German of course, that the Germans had come to Bulgaria to help the Italians who were being defeated by the Greeks. She said this, and it was perfectly true. There were, I think, some German soldiers on the streetcar. So my father picked her up like a football under his arm, jumped out of the streetcar when it was still moving and ran up the street. And of course, my sister has never forgotten that. You just didn't talk about those things, not in public.
Was there any sense at that time
Yeah.
that instead of going to the United States,
Yeah.
maybe the family would have moved either to England or to Israel or to Australia or something like this?
Yeah, we went where we could. I think if it had been impossible to get an American visa, my parents would have tried for some other kind of visa. So it was somewhat accidental. We had a graduate student who's now a professor at University of Illinois, named Enrique Meyer. Enrique Meyer was the nephew of a close friend of my father's in San Francisco. But they had only been able to go to Peru, so to Peru they went. And they became Peruvian like we became American. Though I guess Enrique himself is now becoming American again since he's been in Illinois for years now. Yeah, you couldn't really pick your country. I think my parents, like many people, had a preference for the United States. But we certainly would have gone to Peru or any other place if we had to pick an alternative. So what happened to Jewish refugees if they became American or eventually Israeli or Peruvian had to do with where the opportunity was. John Borneman, who was in the department now at Princeton, asked me once what effect being a refugee in America had. And I couldn't think of it at the time, but I thought of it later. It's a sort of basic American patriotism. Because I remember when I was 9 or 10 being unhappy about something and asking my mother if we could go back to Bulgaria, and she said, she stopped speaking to me for the rest of the day. I mean, people wouldn't act that way now. That was, there was other kinds of ways of raising children in those days than anybody would have now. Children weren't supposed to worry about things. They did, but their parents weren't very good at recognizing it.
Well, what were your then memories and experiences growing up as an 8-9-year-old onwards in California?
Well, Except it wasn't so easy to make friends. I was too shy, not athletic, had this accent which bothered me a lot more than it does now. But again, no one worried about those things. They sort of, if your kid liked books, well, his mother would tell him, go play with other kids in the street. But when he didn't, she had other things to think about. I think a connection was that this crazy man I went to graduate school with, named Alan Colt, but he once said, people who study anthropology are exercising anthropotherapy. And by this he meant that you saw cultural differences as a personal issue. So you do field work to find out more about yourself, to see how the cultural factor affects you or how it affects other people. Might be something to that. Although anthropology has for a long time been more of a mainstream discipline. At the beginning, in America and elsewhere, you had a lot of people from non-American backgrounds, a lot of Jewish people. Just as in England, you had people like Fortas and Evans Pritchard and Max Gluckman, who came from other than standard English backgrounds.
Absolutely. Could you talk us through now a little bit the years in school and then eventually college and your coming to learn of the discipline of anthropology, the people who were significant in the beginning of that process?
Yeah. Well, up to the time I entered college, I didn't know anything about anthropology. I took Anthropology 1, which would be 101 here, to fill a science requirement in an easy way. About that time, I read, I think probably as a freshman, I read Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture. And no one thinks her theory is reliable anymore, but it is a book that kind of takes you into the possibilities of different cultures. And as I said, John Rowe, who taught Introduction to Cultural Anthropology, as sometimes happens with a teacher, he was charismatic from my point of view. I think other people found him rather dull. But he talked about field work, and he talked about what anthropologists did and what the possibilities were. So so as a sophomore, it would be 451, I walked the streets of Berkeley for most of a week, gradually getting excited about the possibility of being an anthropologist, since I had no great desire to be a lawyer. To please my father, I took 2 semesters of accounting. But by my second sophomore semester, I had reorganized my whole schedule to make it fit anthropology. John Rowe gave me 2 handouts. One was for anthropology majors, and the other was how to prepare for graduate school. Now, nowadays it's brochures and fancy posters. In those days they give you a ditto sheets. But the whole thing was just enormously exciting for me, and still is.
Who else was teaching in Berkeley at that time?
It didn't seem to me a particularly small department, but it was. And no one questioned the fact that there were no women on the faculty. So Kroeber and Lowy, the great men of the time, had retired already. I started college in 1950 and they retired early, a few years earlier. So it was Theodore McCown, who was what they then called the physical anthropologist, Robert Heiser, who was the archaeologist, David Mandelbaum, Ronald Olson, John Rowe, and Edward W. Gifford. That was it.
The way that certain people talk about
Yeah.
early anthropology departments, one has the sense that in those days there was both much more linkage between departments, and because they were students of one another, colleagues,
Yeah.
the field was smaller, but at the same time departments were already getting known for certain approaches or styles. What would you say at that period the Berkeley department was instilling in its students?
Certainly the four fields, which was taken for granted that even as a graduate student you had to pass a preliminary examination that included archaeology and biological anthropology. They had specialized in California Indians. This was Kroeber's influence, or in North American Indians generally. Again, it was taken very much for granted. So that's why Bob Smith and I, back in about 1972, started Cornell's first course on American Indians, which I'm still teaching.
So was there the implicit assumption that if you went on to grad school in Berkeley,
Yeah.
that you would do something to do with the native peoples of the North Americas?
It did there, but since I didn't take the trouble to investigate other graduate departments, something fortunate happened, which was that while I was in the Army for 2 years, the department changed. They expanded. They got briefly Clifford Geertz, who I never met. He was gone by the time I got back there. But also Robert Murphy, David Schneider, Edward Norbeck, and Bascom, forgot it, William Bascom, yeah. So when I got back to the department, it was quite different, and for about a semester very difficult for me to adapt to, because the anthropology I'd been taught by the 6 men I mentioned was heavily factual. They had an aversion to theory. So that anthropology for them was, for the cultural anthropologist, was ethnography. When I got back from the Army, it became much more theoretical, so I had to switch. And so for my first semester as a graduate student, which I started late because I wasn't discharged until October 5th and the semester had already begun. So in seminars we took, another guy, Jack Smith, and I, who had both just gotten out of the service, were sort of telling each other, complaining about roughly the long words people used. It took a while to get up to speed, and the theory of those days seems quite simple compared to what people are doing now, but it still took an adjustment. To get a little bit ahead, I took some of the works by Radcliffe Brown or Malinowski or S.F. Nadell with me during my first field trip, which was quite long, 2.5 years. And when I read them in a house overlooking the western beach on the Island of Mucken, they were interesting, but they were also easy. And I think the fact that we thought these theoretical discussions were difficult had to do with stress and lack of familiarity with these things. I suppose while at Cornell, I have often told first-year students who felt out of place in the pro seminar, for example, no, give it time. It'll make sense. Once you get over the idea that other students are so much brighter and theoretically adept than you are, and just read these books for what's in them, things will become much more straightforward. That, and another thing I found out about is that for most theoretical ideas, there are certain basic works. Somebody had the idea to begin with, and other people made a contribution. And if you can find those, then you can be quite up to date as to what's being talked about.
So there was a little hiatus of study in between your undergraduate studies
Yes.
and the graduate because of the service.
And that's when the department changed.
Indeed.
So,
And do you have fond memories of your time in the American military, or
No.
were you posted? What
not
were-
particularly. It made for some good stories afterwards. I was trained as a medic because it happened like this. They asked me what my civilian job was, and I thought it would be snobbish just to say student, which was the truth. So I said I worked for the museum. I did, that was true. And the guy who interviewed me said, you know, these people you worked with, were they scientists? I said, yeah. I said, okay, you were a scientific helper as a civilian. That means medical lab technician in the Army. So I said, great, the Army's going to teach me something useful. That's until we got to Fort Sam Houston, Texas, San Antonio, Texas. And they said, well, you know, the position, MOS, military occupational specialty of medical lab technician, that's been abolished. And if you are physically just somewhat handicapped, you can be an aid man as a stretcher bearer. And if you are more handicapped, you can be a corps man, which means you work in a hospital. And my eyes were actually worse than had been tested, so I became an aid man. That is, until I got to Germany, where at some point they found out I spoke German, so I got into military intelligence. This is how that happened. Americans aren't very good at foreign languages, and in those days they were probably worse than they are now. So, but you don't want to put foreigners in military intelligence because they can't be cleared. So so they took people who were either brought to America as children or who had German parents, because we had American lives and could be cleared. And cleared means that you are certified reliable enough that you can have access to secrets. So the so I was in military intelligence in Berlin, which even us privates thought it was useless. And later we thought it was even more useless. Later, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, it turned out to be even more useless than anyone had thought. We sent people with East German identities to East Germany to spy on the Russians and the East Germans. It turned out after the fall of the Berlin Wall that every one of these spies that Americans had used had either been turned around and became double agents or put in jail. We thought we had some inkling of this. So we had a couple of theories of why we were there. One of them was that they had decided we couldn't soldier. And we hadn't actually broken any rules, so they couldn't court-martial us, so they gave us this harmless thing to do. Our other idea was that somewhere there must be real spies. Now, we know that the information we're collecting was pointless. We never got any feedback on it. And we're there to cover up, is to keep the Soviet East German counterintelligence people busy. Meanwhile, real spies are doing something.
Under deep cover.
Under deep cover.
Yeah, so this is a double bluff.
Yeah. That wasn't, the only thing wrong with that is that there weren't any real spies, but that's, so anyway, I did that for about 1.5 years, and makes for good stories. That was also not as professional an army as the U.S. has now, because there was so many draftees who are people who want to stay out of trouble for 2 years and get discharged. I had volunteered for the draft because I was afraid that the Korean GI Bill would run out. That was what mattered about this law for me, was that they would pay for your education. And they gave me $110 a month after I got out of the Army, and that nowadays would be almost pocket change. In those days, in a university like Berkeley that didn't charge tuition for state residents, you got along with it. And then I took notes for a course on the geography of California, which they sold, and later became a TA. So all this seems like very small amounts of money now, but in those days it was comfortable. And I had, like a lot of people age 21 to 23, I didn't want to take money from my parents because I didn't want them bringing up this fact in inevitable arguments. So the GI Bill seemed to be the answer. So, okay, I wasn't much of a soldier, and this, it wasn't like a time of terrible trouble and hardship and crisis of conscience, none of that. I just wasn't very good at it. And I wasn't very good at this intelligence gathering stuff either, but since I was a college graduate, I knew how to fill out forms and use official language and this kind of thing.
Were there scholarships also available to people like yourself? And did you make use of them?
Not
as
then.
A graduate student?
I got, as a senior, I got the first Lowy Fellowship in honor of Robert H. Lowy, which is $400, but an honor. Later on, there wasn't much. The reasons, this was before what John Moore called war money. This is after, beginning around 1958, after the fact that the Russians launched a satellite called Sputnik before the Americans did caused a lot of the Eisenhower administration didn't want to admit it was their fault. So it was broadened to a notion that American education has weaknesses and therefore we didn't launch a satellite as quick as the Russians. So out of this came a number of programs which they're pretty attenuated now, but they still continue, like the I think it's called something else now, but it was called NDFL, National Defense Foreign Language. Now it's FLAS, right? Foreign Language and Area Studies. Also NSF fellowships and so on. That was just beginning around the time, thanks, that was just beginning around the time I got a PhD. My PhD was in June '63, so I didn't. But I also didn't spend much time in graduate school, so it never came to that. got my money for fieldwork in after 3 semesters from the tri-institutional Pacific program, and this was Yale, University of Hawaii, and the Bishop Museum in Honolulu, and it was supposedly a study of leadership, but they didn't go much into that. What they tried to do was get coverage of Pacific cultures that hadn't been studied enough. So, I got money originally, $9,000, which was more at the time, of course, in beginning of '58. I got this money on condition that I went to the Gilbert Islands, which I didn't particularly want to go to, because like other romantic anthropologists, I wanted to study people who weren't all Christian and sending their kids to school and those things. And my ethnographic area, after some soul searching, was not the Pacific Islands, it was Africa. So the equivalent of the A exam, admission to Canada, the exam here, was an exam called the qualifying exam, and my 3 fields, I think, were history and theory, which was briefly compulsory there, social organization, and Africa. But then I went to the Pacific and later became a member of the American Indian program at Cornell, so I switched areas around.
Was graduate school, at least preparation for fieldwork, an exciting time to be there? Was there a lot of energy among the students and a feeling of we're now embarking on something which is terribly exciting?
Oh yes, there was that. I've always found anthropology exciting, and this included graduate school. But what they didn't have, what was lacking, was any introduction to field methods. I remember just before I left on my first trip to what was then the Gilbert Islands, now Republic of Kiribati, I remember asking David Schneider, what makes me different from any traveler or missionary? I don't know how to do research. And he said, well, you're a man of considerable intelligence, you'll figure it out. And there was very little information about how you went about doing field work.
This legacy, the mystique of the rite of passage of field work, still exists in many departments in the world, I think. And in American ones, there's more of a sense of institutionalizing the methodology. But in Europe, I know that many colleagues set off for their PhD in a way, quite blind and with great trepidation.
I'm probably skipping some bits you want to know about. What I did in the field, it worked pretty well, was to take books which I thought contained good information about the Pacific. We the Tikopia, Salens's social stratification in Polynesia, and Ward Goodenough's kin community and property on Truk. And I read these. And I asked myself if I was going to get the information on Makan that, say, Firth had gotten in Tikopia, what would I have to ask about? It works pretty well.
How did you get to your field site?
Well, information. I went to the Gilbert Islands because it was a condition of my getting a grant, and my father and I tried to figure out how you travel to the Gilbert Islands, and it wasn't well known. So I don't know where I found out about this way of getting there. Maybe when I wrote to the government of what was then the Gilbert and Ellice Islands colony for permission to do research, it came out. But I flew to Australia, and then I lived in Sydney a few weeks, and then a very, I guess he's almost the great man of Gilbert Islands research, named Harry Maud, invited me to spend a week or so in his home in Canberra, and he showed me all these notes and data and so on, both his and Arthur Grimble's. And then I went to Brisbane and caught a ship that happened to be carrying people to, at least to Ocean Island, and it was probably going to pick up phosphate, because this is all local information, because Ocean Island, or Barnaba, was a phosphate mine. And in Ocean Island, we caught one of the smaller ships in the Gilbert and Islands colony's fleet, and went to Tarawa, which was and is the capital of the place. This was before, in my first field trip, there was no air service to the Gilberts at all. So a letter posted in San Francisco would take about 6 weeks to reach me in Makan. So I didn't think this was some romantic place in Papua New Guinea, but it was certainly isolated. And
did you have somewhere to go when you stepped off the boat, or were you in good hands?
No, I stayed in what was called the rest house. It was a large house on the weather side, on the eastern side of the island, which was used by very occasional government officers or people in charge of the co-op to stay there. And on my first field trip, it cost £1 a month to the island government, not so much. And then in 1960, there was the Magistrates' Conference on Makan, and the resident commissioner, that is the governor, except it wasn't worthy of having a governor. What you had was the resident commissioner of the Gilbert Islands colony, who was subordinate to the High Commissioner for the Western Pacific in Suva. And so they needed the house, so I moved into a house that belonged to the High Chief of Makan and Buteriteri, both islands. And it had been built by one of his predecessors, his father's brother. But the chief himself didn't like to live there even when he came to Makan, because it had walls, it was enclosed, and so he lived with his steward next door, who kind of took care of the place. So I lived in the king's house for the rest of my field trip. Later on, there was an argument after the chieftainship was abolished in 1963. The heirs had an argument. They took this house apart, board by board, and distributed it. So after that, I've stayed with relatives, one kind or another. Relatives because by giving names of my family and then my own name to a kid. So there was always a place to stay.
Your name as in Bernd, or as the local name?
As in Bernata. Yeah.
Before we run out of this tape, and I have another
Sure.
one, I'd like
Yeah.
to, for a minute and a half, or perhaps even
Yeah.
two, ask you whether your parents were supportive and interested in your work, and if any of your family ever thought or was able to visit you in a field location.
Oh no. They
Did the dream of having the son be a lawyer ever end?
oh, it ended. But they just want to hear from me often. And I suppose they worried about it. But they also, since I was on my way to being a professor, I think that satisfied them. My mother eventually went to Kiribati, but that's another story. Not to the same place I went to, but to an island called Fanning, Tabuairan. That's another story, but if you have the patience.
Absolutely.
When there began to be talk of independence, the Ellis Islanders agitated for not being part of the same country as the Gilbert Islanders. And the British said, this whole place isn't viable as a country, and if you separate, it will be even more unviable than before. So if you secede from the country, you won't get any other extra islands, you won't get a marine training school and other things. The Ellis Islanders said, we don't care, we don't want to be ruled by the Gilbertese. And so they voted about 96% for separate independence. Well, the British then said, well, we warned you about this. So various Pacific islands, which were notionally part of the Gilbert and Ellis Islands colony, became part of the Gilbert Islands, or what was in 1979 the Republic of Kiribati. So the Republic of Kiribati includes islands which are actually located between Hawaii and Tahiti. There's a 2,000 kilometers east of the themselves. And there is a law in America that if a foreign ship carries people between American ports, it has to stop at a foreign port in between. And for people taking a cruise from, say, San Francisco to Hawaii, it's convenient to have these Kiribati places. And my mother, after bringing me a T-shirt from Tabuairan.
Because she was on a cruise.
I was on a cruise, yeah. But that was, I had hoped to get back to Kiribati this summer, but I delayed too much asking for permission, so it'll have to be next summer.
How many years has it been?
It's been a while, 17 years, since 1987.
Is research permission or visiting permission difficult to get?
Well, I won't know until I try. Not entirely because they have some hope for tourists, but the tourists mostly go to these eastern islands like Christmas Island, where people catch bonefish, tropical bonefish and things like that. Kiribati is one of the least developed countries officially. So like a lot of island countries, the economy runs by foreign aid and by remittances from Kiribati men who are mostly merchant seamen on German ships.
In your first fieldwork period, how did you learn the language, and what kind of linguistic fluency did you attain?
Eventually I became very fluent. I'm afraid I'm not that fluent anymore. But there was a book.
By all means.
This is how it's done. There was this book, which was for colonial service officers, and I more or less memorized it. It's not very, structure is too good a name for it.
Of what kind of language is it?
It's Nuclear Micronesian, which is a sub-branch Well, it's Austronesian, of course, and all of the, apart from the interior of New Guinea and some Melanesian islands, that's the language stock. And within it, it's Eastern Austronesian, Oceanic, and a few other steps, trying to get to Nuclear Micronesian. Nuclear Micronesian are the all of the Micronesian languages except Palauan and Yapese. Now, I bought somewhere, probably, I'm not sure where I got hold of this, maybe in the Gilberts themselves. This Gilbertese English dictionary by the pioneer missionary Hiram Bingham Jr. But the really great, there is this fantastic dictionary, which is encyclopedic, and I also tried reading the monthly newspaper, and
had a romanization system.
Yeah, Hiram Bingham, the guy who wrote this book, developed that. The Catholics didn't like that romanization very much, but they pretty much used it. It's do you read French?
Yes.
No French. Good. Then I can show you. See, these are missionary publications. Let's see. See, note this definition of Hamasu here.
Hérétique de la secte des congrégationalistes établis au Gilbert. Interesting. So you gained fluency in the language. Would you ever write letters or notes
sure.
in the language as well?
Sure.
And the romanization system was well known to indigenous peoples as well?
Oh yeah, they're about 95% literate in their own language, but they didn't. Well, I've been away from it for a long time, but they really, everybody knew how to read and write their own language, but they used it only for certain things, like writing letters and keeping track of debts. And they also wrote, the people who knew it wrote a lot of esoteric knowledge. And it's universal literacy in the sense that everyone is literate with very few exceptions. But it's a literacy that's restricted to certain kinds of activities. Who was it? Somebody has...
Perhaps we can just go back a little also to
Sure.
the focus of the fieldwork and the direction that your 2 years of research took.
Yeah.
What did you end up looking at, and were there any surprises in what you uncovered?
Oh yes, a lot. A lot of surprises.
Please, do tell.
But the reason that they wanted the Gilbert Islands studied was partly because they hadn't been, not by any extended field work, but also because Ward Goodenough, who spent some weeks on a southern island called Onotoa, in, I guess, the middle 50s, had, on the basis of this work, wrote about non-unilineal descent. And Murdoch, who was the great man at Yale, which was one of the participants in the Tri-Institutional Pacific program, wanted to find out about how a cognatic descent system would work. Well, from the way it was described, it wouldn't work at all, because people told me, yeah, of course, you inherit all of the lineage memberships of your father and mother. So I said, if this goes on for another couple of generations, everyone will be able to collect coconuts from every piece of land on Makan. I said, yeah, that's probably how it's going to be. But it turned out I was walking one day with a man named Solomon. Who everybody, when they mentioned him, everybody went like this, because he carried his head to one side. And he said, well, of course, in the past, only people who lived on the land could use it. So I wrote about how a cognatic system might work. The other point was that, like all Pacific Islanders, they practiced several different kinds of adoption. Maybe it's not like all Pacific Islanders, that's dangerous to say, but like most. And at first I just thought, well, any child that's living in a household that is not his or her parents must be adopted. Not so. I mentioned it to my first teacher in Kiribati social organization, a cultural man named Nante Bachabo. And he said, yeah, well, you leave property to your adopted child, but to what I once translated foster grandchild, you get property from the foster grandchild or through the foster grandchild. So what I found out, among other things, was that there was hereditary fosterage. And that it worked pretty much like Leach's matrilateral cross-cousin marriage. That is, child givers and child takers were different, and they very seldom exchanged. But the child givers would, in each generation, give children to the child takers, along with property. So the child givers were generally of higher rank or greater seniority than the child takers. So all of the high chief's children were at least partly brought up by someone else. So what I did over a period of time was collect as many histories as I could of fosterage, because I took these are really nice people. They let you take a census is one thing. I took 4 censuses of Makan. I think it wound up with exactly 300 households. But they let you do that in return for family photographs. So while they were rounding up the kids and putting them in their Sunday clothes, I would ask them questions. And they would ask me questions, because in the 1980s there was a thought, which turned out to have been fairly widespread in the Pacific, that the year 2000 would be the end of the world, like Jesus would return. And people want to know about America and so on. So we had some nice conversations. I also, in the Murdoch system of trying to classify everything, and I was in his department for a postdoctoral year. I had a Mellon Fellowship at University of Pittsburgh. The fact that avoidance was between co-parents-in-law, that is, people told me you were supposed to avoid the parents of your child's spouse. So I said, wow, that's news. So a few days after I found out this great thing, I met a man walking between the two villages on Macken. There are 3 passages, so you can cross at the right low tide, but that's it. So I saw a man, carrying a log, and he said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "Gip." And I asked him where he was going, like you do in the Pacific. He said, "Well, I'm carrying this log to my co-parent-in-law." He said, "I heard people told me you were supposed to avoid this person, not do favors." He said, "Well, that was the old law, the law of shame. We got the new law, the law of love." And yeah, we can do that. Later on, I found there are indeed ways in which you avoid your co-parent-in-law, so that parents will resist their child's getting married to someone who's acting as a kinsman. That is, the marriage becomes possible where kinship has lapsed, but there's a good deal of opposition to marrying with someone who's been acting like even a distant kinsman. That's their rule. What gave me a culture shock, and this is another point, beginning of my field trip, was that the Catholic mission at that time had the policy of trying to separate their adherents from Protestants. And this is on some small island, about 3/4 Catholic. And so Catholics would become excommunicated if their child married a Protestant or was living with a Protestant, or people could not stay in the meeting house if the Protestants were performing, because the main Protestant dance was prohibited for Catholics and heretic. Catholics couldn't belong to a club with any Protestant members. And I really hated that, because it seemed like such an arbitrary, unnecessary thing. By the 1980s, most of that had lapsed, because the French priests had mostly been retired or died. But people attributed it that it's at the beginning of the Catholic mission, or for a long time afterwards, the Catholic priests would be sent to some island for life, essentially, and their horizons narrowed to arguments with the Protestant pastor and things like that. So, and after Bishop Terrien left, they got a good deal more relaxed about that, but not completely.
Did you share your field site with active missionaries who were there at the same time
as
you? And were they...
Some just came on visits, but Father Delacroix and Father Kuhn.
Were these the only other foreigners or Western Europeans apart from yourself?
Oh, yeah.
And were you well received, or
of course.
Did they see you as the savior of indigenous souls, or how?
No, they were just interested in having someone to talk to. Father Delacroix didn't really speak English, so it had to wait till I could speak Gilbertese, and that's what we. And then he made fun of. I learned Gilbertese in the northern dialect, which is not the official dialect, and he thought that was really peculiar and interesting. No, the missionaries were very kind, understanding people who welcomed conversation. But for a while, when there was none of the French fathers were there on Macken, because it was sort of an outlying place. It was Buteriteri is the larger island that Mucken is an outlier of. But for a while there was an Australian priest who was supposed to organize a school which could compete with the government school, because Catholics weren't allowed to send their children to the government school. And we were drinking beer one night, and he said, "Why are, the French fathers so hostile to Protestants?" I said, "I didn't know. I wasn't going to go into that with another priest." But we thought, well, it's the tradition of the mission. The Catholics came in, I think, 1889, when the Protestants were already established. And later on, they were on the outs with the British administration, partly because there was an early resident commissioner named Telford Campbell, who was an Orangeman, and he was very prejudiced against Catholics, so that the Catholic mission sort of turned inward to itself. And on the other hand, what is surprising is how wonderfully people treat strangers. Hardly like field work at all.
Much modern anthropology, as you know, definitely in more remote places, has now become in part an activist movement as well, in which one has to represent the concerns, motivations and needs of the people who one studies. Was there that sense already among the Gilbert Islands?
Not really, but you when you write about a place like Kiribati, you are aware of that whatever you write is going to be read there. So you have to be careful with some things which are quite interesting are not something you can write about. Now, where they what they're surely suffering from is Japanese and Korean fishing techniques in the Pacific. And I wish I could do something about that, but you can't. They use these long line nets, 30 miles long. This is not an exaggeration. 30, let's see, anyway, huge nets. I better check the number, but it's just enormous nets. They scoop up everything. And the Japanese, of course, want tuna for sushi, and that depletes not only what people live on, but also their one chance at some viable commercial activity. And global warming, the place, atolls are going to disappear. And that's what's the matter. But you can't, as an anthropologist, I mean, you can say so, but these are forces that are much more powerful than anyone could oppose. It isn't like being opposed to the Summer Institute of Linguistics or local missionaries and so on. This is, or as in Turney's book about the Yanomamo, some anthropologist who was organizing wars. What really affects these people are global events. Maybe AIDS has gotten there, which, unless larger countries take some responsibility for smaller ones and they don't show any great signs of doing it, there are various disasters that are going to befall them. Also, what people want often isn't what their government wants. Especially in my first field trip, they thought I was an advance agent of the American government. It's that Buteriteri and Mucken have tried to, off and on, to be annexed to the United States since before the British protectorate was established in 1892. And Catholics came in 1885, I think. And the high chief of those days, Nabraymore, had, with a companion, had gone to the United States to offer Buteriter as a coaling station for the American fleet. But he didn't get past San Francisco, and his companion died, and when he got back, the British flag was flying there. So they thought I was going to bring the American government, and that's what they wanted me to do. Later on, there were other theories about why I was really there.
A few words before we move on
Sure.
to then later fieldwork
Yeah.
and the American Indian
Yeah.
community. What were living conditions like during your first fieldwork, and how did you eat, and did you live well? Did you get ill? Were you healthy?
Well, I got ill at the end because I had amoebic dysentery and didn't know it. And then when I was sort of evacuated, I had pneumonia. But, well, it's like camping out. No, at first, in fact, I was told by the then British government that I should bring a 6-month food supply. And so I was in Sydney trying to figure out what I would eat for 6 months. So I got an entire case of corned beef, for example. But there was a store on Tarawa, the headquarters, where you could order sort of miscellaneous canned goods. But later on, no one told me to bring a 6-month food supply anymore. So I'd more and more just ate local foods, which are perfectly okay. I could afford to lose weight. That is, with bicycling everywhere and eating local food, of course I lost weight.
What were the local foods, for example?
Well, breadfruit in season, and a tuber called pulaka by Polynesians. It's Pseudosperma camisonus, which is a variety of taro that is grown on atolls, and a lot of fish. Coconut when I could get it, because people didn't want it known that they would feed a guest coconut. It's too ordinary.
Were there domesticated animals?
Yeah. Pigs and chickens, and when I first got there were a few ducks, but they said the ducks all died out because they introduced tilapia fish to kill mosquitoes, and they said that the guts of a tilapia was poisonous to a duck. I don't know if that's true, but for a while, long before I got there, they had horses to transport coconut and such from the forest, but people now do it by bicycle or by truck, which they also have. You get people, when you visit people, they insist on serving you fish, but if fishing is poor, it's salt tuna and other salted fish, which is like biting into a cake of salt with fish bones in it. But if I know, I never, like so many other field workers, I missed food from back home, but not that much.
We had a local variety of gefilte fish, perhaps. Then.
Yeah, and certain things like raw fish, sort of like Peruvian ceviche, is awfully good. And I like octopus, and I tried, and my first field trip also sort of combined with my 6 other trips. I've been there 7 times and all. To join at least once every form of fishing that I was capable of joining. This excluded spear diving with spears, which I couldn't do. And I was pretty much left with whatever kind of fishing people were willing to have me around for, because of course I was in the way. I mean, I wasn't much good in a canoe and so on. But there were like 50 different ways of catching fish or more. the because they exploit, since if they didn't have the sea as part of their ecology, almost no one could live on these islands. So they exploit just about every niche at sea or on the reef that they could, and exploit it in various other ways. So I think I went fishing just once in all my time in America, but I went fishing a lot there. And I wanted to find the, link the local names of fish with the scientific names, so I went through with fish books.
Right. Well, actually, on that topic, I noted that one of the first things that you did professionally in terms of publications was a Gilbertese word list from the Butariri and Makin dialect.
Did I do it? It was never published if I did that.
It's maybe an unpublished manuscript.
Yeah.
And thereafter, your PhD, I think you defended in 63.
63. I didn't defend because I had no defense.
You
It just had to be approved, submitted.
I see. And then a couple of publications on fosterage in the Gilbert Islands, in ethnology and American anthropology.
I haven't. One thing, I should have published more. And I hope, now that I'm retired, that I think it's urgent to get everything out that I have collected. And I didn't do enough. But
was that because of teaching responsibilities?
It might be because I'd put off things, and then a feeling one hates to admit, that one doesn't have enough to say, and so on. It happens to people, and I have published once on bilateral kinship in the Andes, and I hope, maybe do a few more things. As long as I'm healthy, that also makes it fairly urgent to return to Kiribati, because it isn't that I can't read my field notes. I can, but that they're somewhat out of date. If you're going to talk about the present, it's a question of how people are living now, and I hope to find out.
Absolutely. But after the Gilbert Island experience, and then a few articles, I suppose, you mentioned a postdoc, a melon, then something changed. There was a turn towards the people, the native peoples of this country.
Yeah.
And how did that happen?
Well, it happened because we had no course in it. And Bob Smith and I, here at Cornell. And so Bob Smith and I decided we better give Cornell this course. So I tell people that it might not be the biggest, it wasn't Bob Venables, or the best course in Native Americans, but it's the oldest. The oldest course at Cornell are Native Americans.
What year was it established in by the
I would guess about 1972. I'd have to look it up, but 1972 or 74. I have it written down someplace. And for a while, Charles Hackett took it over, and he was a genius at linguistics and a great man, but he was absolutely not a teacher. And so it shrunk again. And it draws enough students, about 30 this year, that it's worth giving every year. And I greatly enjoy it.
Has it become one of your defining courses?
Oh, yeah. Because, you see, everybody in our department, I think that's true, everybody has either a joint appointment or participates in some program outside the department. Well, mine's the American Indian program.
Did that exist prior
to
you starting
it didn't.
the course? No,
it only got started, I think, in the 1980s. And they would have presumably liked to staff it only with Indians, but that's not possible. So they've had some people with what they call a blood quotient, but people whose blood quotient was 0, like me.
Has it fallen under the auspices of the Einaudi Center, just like the other area studies programs? No.
Because it's the reason is that it's an ethnic studies course rather than an international course. This has to do with how Cornell is organized. In the Einaudi Center, you have what are foreign area programs. So you have Europe, South Asia, Southeast Asia, China, Japan, and Latin America. And then there are ethnic studies, which are African American, that's the Africana Center, Asian American, which is what Viranjani does. Latino, which is what Vilma is involved with, and the American Indian program. The American Indian program is under the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, but there have always been a few arts college courses in it. It's also something, you know, I haven't published enough, and I'm very aware of that, but I also enjoy teaching, and I enjoy writing too. It's just
well, as you know, also your students love your lectures and your teaching style, which has been rewarded over the years.
Yes, it has. I still get good evaluations. If I didn't, I hope if they ever stop getting good evaluations, or I can't learn students' names and so on, I hope I have the sense to stop. But
did the requirement or the desire to start teaching
Yeah.
a course on Native American
Yeah.
peoples then lead to a fascination and a fieldwork exposure to those places?
No, not fieldwork yet, but a fascination, yes. It's if I could do fieldwork, it's somewhat tricky. You really have to know someone. I mean, I do know people from various tribes, but it has to be some kind of arrangement, because American Indians really as they should, of course, but they really control the kind of research that can be conducted there. But heck, I'd like to do it.
I'd like actually to ask a
Yeah.
few things about the department, and
Yeah,
perhaps end
sure.
with a few reflections backwards and
Yeah.
a couple of thoughts that I have. But as we mentioned earlier, departments often have a flavour or a feeling to them.
Yes.
And you've been here quite a while now. You've known,
Since 1964.
Well, there you go. You've known
Yeah.
David Holmberg's father, Alan Holmberg, I'm
Sure.
sure.
He was
You knew
chair.
Victor
He was
Turner at Orison Sharp, no doubt. Perhaps
Sure.
you could tell me a little about some of these characters who, for the generations of students of anthropology who follow, will be just names on a book. Perhaps you can make them come
Yeah.
alive a little,
Well,
stories or words.
I think most people would say that the most unforgettable character was Victor Turner, who was, sometimes when I've used things he's written in courses, I ask people what they thought he looked like, and they sort of think a lean British intellectual. But actually, Victor Turner looked like Santa Claus. I mean, he had this huge belly. I mean, he didn't have a beard, but Victor, among other things, gave a seminar for graduate students and faculty, met at his house once a week. Terry was part of it then too, in Terry's first stint at Cornell. And Edie, Victor's wife, would serve beer, and he would just sort of sit in an armchair and hold forth. And he had, I think, some of his most important ideas while he was teaching here, like the notion of communitas. I think Victor really thought that anthropology should be someone's life, and vice versa. So when students were interested in communes, he got interested in communes too. And
Did he become a good personal friend and a colleague with whom
yeah,
you shared a lot of ideas?
yes.
What was he like, do you think, for students to work with?
Well, of course, they flocked to him. And, of course, he established called myth, ritual, and symbol is still being taught. I taught it for a while myself. Yeah, he, I don't know how he was as an undergraduate teacher, probably not that great because he read his lectures and so on. But for graduate students, he was inspiring. And he was on a lot of committees. I was too. That is, at one point I was on 40 committees in the early 70s. But, you know, then others have taken over now, of course. But it was, I think Victor probably wanted the department to go in other directions than it was going.
What would those have been?
Well, in what was then called symbolic anthropology. And the people who really ran the department, Alan Holmberg and Laurie Sharp and Morris Opler, were really interested in other things. Before I came here, what was then called applied anthropology, I think we'd now call it development anthropology or some such, was the heart of the department. Victor, I think, came a year before I did, so he was not part of the way the department was founded. But Holmberg, Sharp, and Opler were. And the idea was that they would study different areas of the world and get some general principles of development. The most famous, of course, of all those were Alan Holmberg's work in Vicus. But Morris Opler, who originally was an authority on the Apaches, but he did fieldwork in North India, again from the point of view of development, and Laurie Sharp worked in northern Thailand. And then somebody else, and I'd have to look it up to make sure, also did some work in the Navajos. I don't think a regular faculty member, which is why I can't remember it. But just before I came here, and the reason I got the job, was that they had gotten a grant from the National Institutes of Health to organize a department of general anthropology. So Tom Lynch for archaeology, Kenneth Kennedy for biological anthropology, and me as a social anthropologist were hired in '64 under this grant, which also, it paid some salaries, not mine, but I think Kennedy's, and it also paid for where a lot of graduate fellowships came. So the graduate program really expanded to the point when some of the people who were here thought we had way too many graduate students, should cut back. That was the NIH grant. But Laurie, when I came, he was already beginning to withdraw from the department. In those days, you had to retire at 65, and there wasn't much tradition of someone teaching past retirement the way I'm doing. But
what was he like? What were the characters of the department like at that time?
well,
Alan Holmberg, for example, who I've seen on film,
Yeah.
immortalized in the film about the Vicus project. But
yeah, he was certainly a gentleman, and I only knew him for a couple of years, because I came in '64, and I think within a year or two he got sick and died. I'm not so sure what his interests were. They're probably things connected with Vicos as much as anything. Laurie Sharp, on the other hand, was kind of pioneered using networks. I mean, there are also others, certainly in Britain, people like Gulliver, but he and Opler had started when an ethnography was sort of a catalog of cultural traits, and his own notion was called themes, sort of guiding principles that define different cultures. But nothing much came of it because anthropology moved in other directions. The trying to catalog cultures and then find underlying principles kind of went out after a while. But the rising star in the department when I came was Bill Skinner. He was a China person and worked with Arthur Wolf, who was also here and also concerned with China. Skinner was very intense and a difficult person to get along with. And when he's still alive, so I have to be careful. What happened is, I think he wanted to return to the department, and the people who in those days ran the department didn't want him to, especially Turner. He got good students. I mean, they may have resented him when they were his students because his ideas of working were greater than almost everyone's. Like, he once, in my first year, someone came up in a conversation and Skinner said, he wants to live a normal human life, and that's not enough anymore. I mean, people have told him that too. They haven't. They let you live a normal human life and
more or less
be an academic person too, well, as it should be. Well, and Jack Roberts was here when I came. He was not really a quantitative anthropologist himself, but he admired people who were. And one of his great contributions was the notion of styles of games as connected with culture, and everyday life in Sunni culture. Did a lot. The department is much bigger. I mean, there's a lot of talk about there not being enough people to teach certain courses or to be on committees and so on. But that's because people have these double and triple appointments. But actually, if you just count the number of faculty and don't worry if they're full-time or half-time, it's a much bigger department than when I came.
In your 30-odd
Yeah.
years of
Yeah.
being here at Cornell, there must have been a great many changes in the style and content of the department, and I'd be interested for any reminiscences you have. But I'd also like to ask something that I've noticed.
Yeah.
My training has been in Europe, as you know,
Yes.
where we have traditionally quite fractured departments between biological, social, and then, of course, archaeology. But here in our department, here we have
Yeah.
Marissa, we have Tom Follman, both archaeologists are interested, of course, in social anthropology as well. Yet, there are a whole bunch of other archaeologists,
Yeah.
who are downstairs. What is the history of this, and how
Well,
have these
this has to do
happen?
with the fact is that used to be an interdepartmental archaeology program, which I think, as far as it still exists, it's been administratively merged with anthropology. And there was considerable strain between the archaeologists and some, if not all, cultural anthropologists, because the archaeologists have felt that there weren't enough of them to maintain a graduate program. It should be better now because John Henderson and Tom Bowman have been around for a long time, and Nerissa, I don't know if she has tenure, but if she doesn't, it would be this year that she comes up. And now Kirk Jordan, who's an archaeologist. So they always felt that there weren't enough of them to teach the courses if someone was on leave, or enough so that someone could do field work and still have the archaeology graduate students working with someone on the faculty. That may be better now, but it's been quite a strain. Especially the archaeologists outside the anthropology program, wanted a PhD program, but the only way they could have one is if the anthropology department gave up some of its fellowships, because the graduate school was forced to play the zero-sum game, where there could only be so many fellowships, period. And of course, we resisted that. This came up the last year that I was director of graduate studies in 93, 94. And of course, if you ask departments to give up something so that other people can gain, they're going to resist, and so we did. Biological anthropology has been in that situation, only more so because there were fewer of them. For a while there were three biological anthropologists. There was Kennedy and Brooke Thomas and Bill Steeney. But Steeney didn't get tenure, and Brooke Thomas went to UMass. And then there was a great deal of quarreling with or about Ken Kennedy. But and Rada Dyson Hudson also didn't get tenure. In Bill Steeney's case, the department wanted to give tenure, and the biologists turned him down, and biologists on the ad hoc committee. And in Rada Dyson Hudson's case, the department eventually changed its mind. It didn't recommend her for promotion. Well, Meredith came, and Meredith didn't want graduate students because she said that there weren't enough facilities. See, as you know, probably she's a primatologist, and she thought, and probably Adam Arcady Clark agrees, that for someone to be a primatologist, they have to go somewhere where there is a primate colony, which there was no chance of getting here. So, at various times, both the biological anthropologists and the archaeologists here have thought that they were, not only that the department was fractured, but that they were being pushed to a marginal place where they had been promised something better than that. So it happened here too, did. The department always, compared to Berkeley and Pittsburgh, which are the only two departments I've had experience with, has been much more democratic. Like we've always had one person, one vote. So even for things, so hiring, if you were an assistant professor who came that year, you still had one vote in or the hiring decisions. And like most small to medium departments that are run democratically, a lot of emphasis was put on consensus, and this could be really hard to achieve. The campus troubles in the late 60s hit us hard enough and sort of more or less alienated some people from the rest of the department. It happened. It's easier now, I think, because there's less factional thing, and it's now possible. I went to, I think, one faculty meeting last year. I haven't been to one yet this year. And officially, emeritus professors can attend meetings, they can't vote. And it didn't seem, I mean, when you retire, attending meetings is not your favorite.
Not your highest priority.
Not the highest priority, not something you miss. But there is a much greater tendency now for routine matters to be handled routinely, rather than to be elevated to great moral issues as occasionally happened in the past.
Well, that's good. That's an endorsement of the present leadership to say
Yes,
that
the
things are...
present, and they worry a lot, and whoever is chair is sort of unhappy at the way things are going. But it's easier now. I think compared to the past, people stick to the subject more and are less likely to lecture their colleagues about this or that. Anyway,
perhaps I could end with a couple
Sure.
of final short questions,
Yeah.
and then maybe let you
Yeah.
have a final say.
Yeah.
One is that over my time here, I've come to know something about your own commitment and contribution to the department.
Yeah.
And I think, if I'm correct in saying, that many of the graduate students who like to apply for conference funding
Yeah.
or a little bit of fieldwork funding have you, I think, and maybe your family largely to thank for that.
they do.
The endowment. And
Yeah.
also the seminars that are organized, the dynamic seminars you have on Friday afternoons.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could tell me, and I know you're famously humble, so I won't ask you to declare too much, but when you thought of doing that and what you thought to give back.
It was when, as I said, my uncle Fritz, my mother's brother, hid out in Amsterdam like Anne Frank, only he did it successfully as he survived the war. And he was unhappily married and was one of these people who's interested in the way money behaves. It's not the same thing as being stingy, but so he had a woman friend, and she persuaded him to divide his inheritance into 4 parts. 2 of them were the grandchildren of his wife from a previous marriage, but the other 2 were my sister and me. Well, when I got it, I did think of giving something back, and I was grateful to the department for letting me hang around. As I said, it's a lack of publications are a bit sensitive issue. Anyway, I was grateful to the department, and so Laurie Shaw wanted something named after him, but he didn't realize it cost about $20,000. It does, to get a room named after somebody. Never mind how much a building costs, I have no idea. So I originally gave money on the installment plan to have our seminar room. No one refers to it as the Holmberg Sharp Room, but there's a plaque there that Fred Gleach put up. And well, after I paid for that, I decided it would be nice to give $5,000 or $6,000 a year to the department, and I've done this. Well, you have to have a certain amount of money to do it. If you've got a kid in college, it's not going to work. But because it's tax deductible, it isn't quite as much as it looks. So so there was already, the department already had a small endowment from people gave money in memory of Alan Holmberg, and so this money became part of it, and also a former undergraduate, I'd have to look up her name because I don't quite remember, but she, quite to the surprise of the department, got in. She has a job as a money raiser in New York, and to our surprise, was willing to contribute to the department to help it raise money. And there's an annual speech, an annual lecture. Someone makes a trip to New York to lecture to the alumni as part of this woman's policy. And so we raise some money that way. It's, I think, we're over $200,000 now, which compared to the endowments of other departments is a drop in the bucket. But it
helps sustain.
It helps because graduate students need to do things that their grants don't cover, like attend conferences or prepare their dissertation for submission. We thought of it at first in sort of emergency terms. Someone has to visit his family in emergency, but really it isn't. It's in professional development, and it's made me quite happy. Obviously, I can afford it, or I wouldn't do it, but I like doing it too.
Well, it's a wonderful thing to be able to contribute, and I know that the students and also the faculty appreciate it a great deal.
Oh, sure.
Might be a suitable moment for me to say thank you, Bernd, for your time. And
you're most welcome.
Ideas. I hope I haven't kept you.
No, you haven't. I just wanted to show you.
Please do.
This is this is how he. This is Hiram Bingham Jr. How he defines. It's the ordinary word for dance is roya, but here is
Roya, noun. Heathen chanting accompanied with gestures, slaps, and stamps.
That's him. He also has another one, which I don't quite know what it was. It's extinct now, but